Jensen and the Lady of the Manor by Joel Sanderson. Read by Joel Sanderson. Part 4. "Good morning, Mr. Jensen," said the young policewoman, standing in the doorway. "Officer Stone, sir. I wonder if I might come in." "Well, of course, officer," I said, trying not to look as flustered as I felt. As my heart raced, I tried to appear as calm as I could. "What can I do for you?" I asked, as I brought her into the living room. She glanced at the parts of model railway that festooned almost every surface. Lifting a small shunting locomotive from the coffee table, I said, "Tea?" "Oh, yes," she replied, as she sat down. I went to the kitchen and tried to steady my nerves. I could hear her from the tiny apartment kitchen as she said, "We wondered if we could talk to you about a series of robberies." I nearly dropped the kettle I was filling. "A series of robberies?" I replied. "Yes, sir, all taking place locally," she said, and drew out a printed list which she laid on the coffee table as I returned to the living room. "May I?" said, as I picked up the list and glanced at it. There were 5 addresses. I quickly read them, noticing Mrs. Sinclair's was the final one. "Yes, 4 of these were mine." "But what brings you to see me in particular?" I said. "It's just that all these houses were insured with the Faversham Insurance and Indemnity Company." I watched her face as she said the words. Through my mind a tumble of thoughts cascaded. How had they put these things together so very quickly? "Well, I'm sure they are," I replied. "But I no longer work there, officer. Perhaps you should talk with them." "Oh, we have," she said. "A Mr. Wilkes, most cooperative." "Sebastian," I said. "Yes, I'm sure he would be." I went back to the kitchen and returned a moment later with a tray of tea and some digestive biscuits on a silver Jubilee plate, which I placed on the coffee table. I poured 2 cups and topped them up with a little milk. "Sugar?" I said. "Just 1, please," replied Officer Stone. I tried to steady my hand, though it trembled as I poured the teaspoon of sugar and then stirred the tea. "We're talking to all the staff," she continued. "I understand you worked there until recently." "Yes, 2 months ago. Staff layoffs," I said. "COVID. Well, your name came up, and I wondered if anything struck you." "That's very thorough of you," I said. "We like to be thorough, Mr. Jensen," she replied, as she sipped her tea. "These are certainly clients of the company," I agreed, quietly noting the fact that most of the more valuable items taken from the houses were concealed within 5 meters of where she sat. I continued, "But they would be. Faversham's was the only insurer in town until 5 years ago, you see. And Aldwych Insurance, who had that big office on the High Street, closed down theirs 3 years ago and sold the portfolio to Faversham's. So it's really not so surprising. It's just it seems an odd coincidence," she persisted. "Well," I continued, "I'm not sure I can really help you. I'm more or less aware of the contracts, but couldn't really tell you much about them." "I see," she replied, and glanced around the room. "You live here alone?" "Yes, it's just me," I answered. "I see. And are you working now?" "Not so much," I replied, "just working on an article now and then for model railway publications." "Really?" she said, her curiosity kindled. "Yes, it's just a hobby, really," I said, "but it keeps my writing skills on track." She looked blankly back at me, not noticing the clumsy pun. "I really don't see how I can help you," I continued. "I wondered if you could see anything these places had in common, anything that might link them together." I picked up the list again and studied it. There was plenty that linked them together. They were all a little out of the way. They all had Wi-Fi-based alarms, and all the owners liked to travel, with one exception, the house that I'd not robbed. "You know," I said, "I've been to some of these places, and they're all a little out of town," I said, "with the exception of this one." "Yes," she replied, "that does seem to be the odd one out." I guess she had a great deal of other information that confirmed that. It was only in there to confuse things. Looking at the list once more, I frowned and then said, "I suppose—" "Yes," she said, craning forward. "I suppose there is one other thing they have in common. But no, it's not really right." "What do you mean?" said Officer Stone. "These contracts. I don't really like to say it, really." "What is it?" she pressed. "These are all contracts managed by Sebastian Wilkes," I said. "Yes," she replied. But aren't all the policies at Faversham's handled by Mr. Wilkes? Oh, no, I replied. There are 5 other managers. So the probability of all being Sebastian's clients is, I thought for a moment, 3 in 100. Now that is a coincidence. The police officer looked at me directly, sizing me up. Perhaps I was just deflecting her attention. But what I said was true, and a very convenient truth considering I happened to work equally with the other managers. A truth that would reasonably move attention away from me. After Officer Stone left, I resolved to do nothing that might attract attention. I sat quietly, taking calm and steady breaths. I would have to mention this to Mrs. Sinclair, and avoiding clients at Faversham Insurance Company would be a good idea for a while. It was only after the police officer had been gone for an hour or so that I noticed the bright red panties on the sideboard, like a bloody red flag. I remembered her words. "You live here alone?" Police Officer Stone might be a good deal smarter than I gave her credit for. It was a disturbing thought. I picked up the panties from the sideboard and thought of tossing them out. It was a strange moment as I realized I really didn't want to. Instead, I took them into my bedroom and placed them on the bedside table. I stared at them there, red and beacon-like. This was ridiculous. I really should just toss them out, but I didn't. Instead, I slipped off my jeans, and a moment later I pulled them on, immediately feeling a thrill. A couple of days later, on a footpath overlooking a remote copse of beech trees, I talked with Mrs. Sinclair, a vision in Burberry and Hunter Wellies. "No," she said, "you absolutely should target a house insured by Faversham's." "Are you crazy?" I said. "It makes sense. They'll think that if it were someone at Faversham's, they'd be aware of the police interest, and that would scare them off. In a way, that might make them think they're on the right track." I looked at Mrs. Sinclair with new respect. "I think you've got something there." I handed over the painting I'd appropriated for her that weekend. "No trouble?" she said. "None. Rather too easy, actually. Well, the former owner is going spare. He thinks Dominic stole the painting, apparently. It's rather funny, actually. They're running around like headless chickens." "But no police involvement?" I asked. "No, he's not going to report it. He's got too much to lose." I noticed it wasn't on Officer Stone's list. I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, but Mrs. Sinclair quickly dispelled that. "And your punishment? You did as you were told?" I sheepishly said I did. "Good. I like to think of you skulking around in my panties. It amuses me." "Well, I think it may have amused that cop as well. I think she saw the panties on the sideboard in my living room." Mrs. Sinclair laughed, and I noticed an edge of cruelty in her tone. "You're nuts," I said, feeling ashamed. She replied, "I'm not the one wearing the panties." Be sure to subscribe. Jensen's adventures continue next week. You can find more stories at FionaDobson.com.